Of course, welcome, Mr. Van Lierop, Raphael. Thank you so much for joining us here today. This is the last in the term, but certainly not the last in the publishing speaker series that is being hosted through the University of Winnipeg Department of English. And we're delighted to have Canadian content producer and publisher who is centering Canadian stories and Canadian immersive experiences with his work. As always, because we're speaking to you from the University of Winnipeg, well, technically my home, but on behalf of the University of Winnipeg, we want to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory. We are located in the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. We in the English department recognize the role of the English language and English as an academic discipline in contributing to the historical and present formations of settler colonialism and imperialism in Canada and around the world. In expressing our land acknowledgement, we commit ourselves to engaging with, questioning, and challenging these formations in ways that support the decolonizing work being done by Indigenous peoples in Manitoba and elsewhere. And we are joined today by Mr. Raphael Van Lierop, who is speaking to us from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Hinterland Studios, headed by Mr. Van Lierop, acknowledge their continuous responsibility to advance the cause of reconciliation here in Canada. So for those of you who are students of my class and aren't here just because they are fans of the awesome Mr. Van Lierop's work, quick bit of introduction. He's the founder and chief creative officer at Hinterland. He established the studio in 2012 to create thoughtful, innovative worlds that engage players in the joy of exploration and also apparently dying of cold. Hinterland, with Van Lierop at its head, has focused on creating immersive environments and engaging gameplay. The studio's first title, The Long Dark, was released in 2014, and the story mode, entitled Wintermute, has released 4 of those 5 episodes. Now, it's particularly exciting that we have Raphael with us today because it's been a bit of a busy week, and I'm going to do a little bit of a plug here because on December 5th, the first expansion to the survival mode for Long Dark was launched, which is Tales from the Far Territory. For those of you on PC gaming, congratulations, it's on Steam and Epic. For those of us like myself who are on console, we have to wait a little bit longer. But first DLC expansion since the launch of the game in 2014, which incorporates some new narrative elements and a number of gameplay improvements. So I'm looking forward to that once I'm able to get that. So with that, I will say thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'd also like to give a special plug. Thank you so much for making the game accessible to my class. Hinterland actually gave copies of the game to my entire student body. And so we were really grateful for this to be able to be a shared experience that everyone was able to access. So thank you so much. And yeah, well, welcome to cold and sunny Winnipeg, sort of. What is weather like in Vancouver right now?
It's dark right now, but I think it's much warmer than where you are, which is not really in theme with the game, but we'll just pretend.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that we're very familiar with the experiences that you're trying to evoke. I was chatting with my students about how the blowing of the wind outside and that sort of cold, chilling feeling is really refreshing when you're playing the game in August, and is really uncomfortable when you're playing it in November, because it was just sort of piling on with all of that coldness. Why the North? What was it about the North that was appealing to you?
Okay, so before I answer that, first let me jump in and say thank you for the wonderful introduction, and also we really appreciate the land acknowledgement as well. I also am here representing a team. You know, I get a lot of attention and praise for having founded the studio and started the project, but of course I don't work on this game by myself. There's a team of 75 people at Hinterland that are working on the Long Dark and other things that are unannounced, and so I just wanted to acknowledge also that there's a team behind me. There's nothing in game development that happens on your own. So I try to say we as much as I can. Sometimes I say I. When I say I'm usually quite deliberate in saying I. Generally, it's very much a we kind of effort. Why set it in the North? You know, I feel like I feel a bit called out. I feel like I should explain also that I've spent a lot of my life living out east in Eastern Canada as well, so I'm very familiar with very cold winters. So the Long Dark is not only so the landscape is inspired by the West Coast, Pacific Northwest, Vancouver Island where I live, the West, the mainland, and probably north of British Columbia as well in the Yukon. But the winter and the experience of winter is definitely inspired by my own, growing up out east and living through some very many cold winters. Well, I sit in the north. So prior to founding Hinterland, I worked in what's called sort of the AAA games industry, which is, I guess, the equivalent of what you would call the blockbuster industry if it were film. And for about 12 years, and I worked on some pretty big projects, led some pretty big teams. And one of the common denominators there was, big budgets, big international ambitions. And as a result, you tend to kind of soften the edges of any kind of personal stories that might go into those games or any sort of expression of your own sort of national identity, in this case, Canadian identity. And I guess it's a little bit like if you work in film, and I might refer to film a lot because it's maybe more of a well-understood medium, but it's like all those films where Vancouver or Toronto stand in for, American cities. And for me as a game developer and as a creator and as a proud Canadian, it was always frustrating to me that we couldn't, find an opportunity to get more of our own voice in there. And also working in the larger blockbuster industry, I mean, I think this is a very common story that it's not really the right venue to tell more personal stories or do more creative work that's really motivated by trying to do something innovative. And so when I started Hinterland, I was really determined to try to break the mold and create something that was much more personal, much more, to my own tastes. And with very modest expectations, it's not that I think my tastes are particularly mainstream. In fact, I'm constantly surprised by the success of the Long Dark because it started out as a project that had very kind of artsy aspirations. It was never really intended to be a survival game per se, like within the confines of a genre. It was really more about exploring a wilderness and having the exploration of that wilderness be the obstacle itself. So no monsters to fight, no combat, really just about
the bear in episode 2 is pretty alarming. You say no monsters, but that's a scary bear.
Well, yeah. So it's interesting though, because a lot of people who play the Long Dark talk about it as though it's a horror game. It's a scary game. And I don't think it's a scary game. I think it's a game that makes you feel very vulnerable, which is frightening for people. And I think that's an experience that most of us don't have in the daily world. So why the North? That's really the answer. Because the North is imposing, it's majestic, it's frightening for us who don't live that way. And most of us don't live that way anymore. In Canada, we are such an urban population, mostly huddled around the US border. So, I think it plays on survival mythology. It plays on the sense of vulnerability of being in the wilderness. It plays on the fear of what happens when, the internet, cell phones, online banking, whatever, all the infrastructure of our daily life is suddenly taken away and we're exposed, to nature. And what we try to communicate through the mechanics of the game and through the narrative of the game is not that nature is an opponent, but that nature is neutral. Nature, Mother Nature, if I can refer to it that way, is very indifferent to your existence, very indifferent to your survival. And so that's frightening, right? Because we have a very egocentric point of view of our place in the world and how important we are as humans. Yeah. And in an experience like the Long Dark, you kind of realize it's not really true. You're not that important. Your survival is really more about trying to find some kind of sense of equilibrium. And even within survival mode in the Long Dark, which for many people, they either start there and it kind of becomes the game for them, with Wintermute, the story mode being more about kind of world building, or they start with Wintermute and get invested and then still spend the majority of their time in the open sandbox of survival mode. There's no way to win. It's not a game that you can win. You're going to fail. You're going to die at some point. There's no question. It's inevitable. it's just a matter of how will you die and how long can you survive. And I think that in itself is also very um, for the person in the right mindset and the person that comes to it with the right objectives, it can be kind of a triumphant experience. But for a lot of people, it's a very unsettling experience. You know, it's not something that a lot of games do, and many of them are not so kind of in your face about it. So that's a little bit about why the North. It's also a little bit about why the Quiet Apocalypse, why the Long Dark, um, and you know, relevant to this talk specifically, I think it's also about representing an IP that has a very strong Canadian identity. And even though we as Canadians all know that it's not the case, I think as an international experience, and we do have a very international audience, we're not, you know, yes, we have probably a disproportionate number of Canadian players relative to other games, but our biggest player communities are not in Canada. We have a, you know, huge American community, which is not surprising, but we also have a huge community in China, Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, you know, the Western Europe, Eastern Europe. Like it's really a properly international IP. And for people around the world who have never experienced Canada for themselves, you know, the Long Dark as a concept really plays on sort of this popular mythology of what Canada is. It's like, oh, it's a, you know, a frozen wasteland with no, yeah, with no power.
Giant bears and scary wolves
bears.
and all of that.
Yeah, where nature is a thing that cannot be ignored, and I think that's always been kind of at the heart of the Long Dark.
Okay, well, you covered sort of like 3/4 of what we had set out, because that vulnerability of the apocalypse. Now, you mentioned survival mode. You will die. You will fail. Do you see your game as optimistic or nihilist then?
I see it as optimistic in the sense that I think people can derive something important from playing it that helps them to understand themselves better and maybe see the world in a different way. And that may sound high-minded, and I know that not every player that plays it has that experience, but we hear consistently from players that that is something that they experience when they, you know, start to really sort of commit to the world and invest time. And it's not uncommon for us to have players who've put hundreds, if not thousands of hours into the game. And for them, it becomes almost more of a, like a pastime than just playing a game. And a lot of them go to Great Bear Island as a true form of escapism.
Yeah.
And we've heard from many of them over the years that have struggled with, you know, substance abuse or failed marriages or, you know, whatever dark situation that they're dealing with, who have said, you know, your game was part of my healing process. There was something meditative about it. There was something important to me at the time where I was able to find some solace in that quiet wilderness. And so I am optimistic. I think it's an optimistic message. I think it's a message that, you know, about resilience. It's a message about personal accountability. It's a message about community, you know. I mean, it's ironic to say that here on a Zoom call with a bunch of people that are not in the same place, but when, you know, 10 years ago, when I originally really conceived of the Long Dark as a concept, I was very much motivated by, you know, my own thinking about what community, like local community means. And, you know, living in the city at the time, and we've all, those of us who live in the city in like apartments and whatnot, you know, how many of you actually know who your neighbors are? And even if you live in homes in residential neighborhoods, how many of you really know your neighbors? And there's this whole weird misplaced sense of community at times. At least back then it really felt, I think we see things a bit differently now post-COVID, because we've realized how much being online with other people has been a lifeline for many of us. But
well,
back
and
then
incidental contact becomes that new community, because it you know, we are so isolated in a lot of ways that even just like seeing someone at a grocery store, suddenly there's human contact. So there is that sort of, yeah, I think we have shifted how we define that.
Exactly. I think that's very true. And that's why it feels, but back, you know, 10 years ago, it really felt like social media was, you know, on its ascent, and it was really so overwhelmingly influential. And, you know, people were spending all their time in Facebook and various platforms like that, nurturing community connections, but not really knowing who their neighbors were in the real world. And I think we've tried to touch on that theme in the narrative mode, particularly of the Long Dark and Wintermute, and the people that you meet along the way, the other survivors, the other people left behind, and I think through the actions and the choices of Mackenzie or Astrid, who you play, in the game, you see the choices that you make as those characters to take care of the people that are out there. There's not necessarily a sense of that like selfishness that you see in a lot of games where it's all about you. I mean, it is all about you. It's ultimately a first person experience. It is about you as a player, but you're also taking care of other people that you meet, and you're trying to make a difference in a hard world. And I think that is ultimately an optimistic message.
Well, and I'm just thinking within episode 1, the fact that it's not an optional mission to feed Grey Mother.
Yes.
You don't get to say, no thanks, I'm just going to collect all this food for myself. There is a duty of care that you've built into narrative progression, which I think is quite neat to situate how Will needs to be in community in order to survive and to exist in that space.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was on purpose that Grey Mother's the first character that you meet in the game, apart from Astrid at the very, very opening. And that there is this, we could spend a lot of time talking about the difference between Grey Mother's characterization in the original rollout of episode 1 and the characterization in the Redux version of episode 1. And there's a very interesting game design and narrative design discussion around that, because you start to realize how much player sentiment about gameplay is influenced by the characterization of the character that they're performing the actions for. So if you have someone who isn't really likable, which again in a non-interactive medium like television or film, you wouldn't have any problems as a writer coming up with a character who's maybe not so friendly, and still you would align goals so that the protagonist would have a reason to work with them or for them, and they would accept that, and you would accept it as a viewer. But when it's you performing the actions, you have very different feelings about it. It can feel very frustrating. But
you need to care about it. Yeah, that's
right. And so you're absolutely right that there is this sense that you're responsible for her. And we try to represent something about who Mackenzie is in those moments. He has a goal. He has something he's very frantically trying to accomplish. He's really worried about Astrid. He doesn't know what happened to her. What's going on in the world right now? There's something bizarre happening, and yet he, not completely selflessly, but he does stop and help, and as you say, go above and beyond what's necessary to help this woman. And I think there's a sense at the end when he leaves her, a sense of reluctance about that. He knows he needs to continue looking for Astrid, but there's a part of him that doesn't feel great about that. And
so you had mentioned a little while ago, and then we've gotten into some really neat stuff about that sort of the northern and the isolation. But I wanted to sort of circle back. You mentioned the art style and your vision for the art form of this particular game. Can you speak to what was it about the particular, because it is a very stylistic form of the faces in the north. And I mean, the north is absolutely gorgeous. But in class we actually I played a little clip of the walking up towards the dancing waterfall, and you've created this incredibly beautiful space that is also, in my mind at least, I know you've said that it's ambivalent. I think it's trying to kill me. It seems to be trying very hard to kill me. But what was your inspiration for the art style and the visual material and the visual sort of focus that you ended up coming out with? And this is probably a we question rather than a you specifically, but I know that this is
no, I mean it started as an I, and it got became we quickly, and now it's obviously a group effort and has been for many years. But the original intention, there's probably 3 different parts to that, the reasoning behind it. The first one is the first 2 are very practical and kind of boring, but I think they're still worth talking about, which are when you are creating something new in a very crowded market, you want it to stand out. And for me personally, photorealism, which is often a goal of a lot of game developers and all the technology that's developed constantly to make characters look more realistic, make worlds look more realistic. Like for me, I'm not that interested in trying to make video games that look like the real world. I don't think that's particularly interesting or challenging. I think it's way more interesting to create an art style that is iconic, that when you look at a screenshot or a clip of gameplay footage, you immediately can identify that's what the game is. From a marketing standpoint, that's extremely important. And as a smaller independent studio, you need to try to do that, because you're never going to be able to compete with the massive studios with the huge budgets that are chasing that more kind of higher fidelity experience. So it's a challenge to come up with an art style that stands out as an iconic and also that ages well. So we're quite fortunate, I think, that we made some good decisions early on 10 years ago. And now we have a game that still looks pretty good 10 years later, even though we've slowly updated it over time here and there. It fundamentally still is the same art style as we started 10 years ago. And probably in 10 years, it'll still look good. It doesn't get dated too quickly. So that's important. There's also the production realities. Making really high-end content, it takes a lot of people and a lot of time. So we chose an art style that was a little bit more achievable for a smaller team. And then the third thing is really more kind of creative. It's really that, for me, it was extremely important that we contrasted let's call it the hostility of the environment, even though it's maybe not an active hostility. The danger, the fact that, as you said, every second that goes by, you're slowly dying.
The constant tick down of the food and the water and that's stressful. That is stressful.
It's stressful, anyway. But it's done against the backdrop of this beautiful environment, and it's also poetic. And I think this idea of a beautiful nature that is slowly killing you is interesting to me. So instead of making it look like another gray-brown apocalyptic setting that's clearly obviously super hostile just by looking at it, you've got this environment that sometimes you can crest a hill and look out over a landscape or a sunset or whatever and stop for a few seconds and think, wow, that's really beautiful. And then you're like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm also still dying.
I should probably get inside somewhere.
That's right. Yeah. So I personally find that to be really interesting, that contrast. And again, I think it reinforces some of the themes that we talked about before in terms of the power of nature and kind of where you stand within it. And there's a sense of majesty that comes from that. When you're looking at the night sky and you see the aurora, it's beautiful, but it's also this reminder of how small you really are in the grand scheme.
Now, to speak to the aurora, how wide for those of us who have played fairly early in Wintermute, do we find out how widespread the geomagnetic disruption is? Is that something you're willing to tip your hand on? Can we get?
So we've obviously been building up a lot of stuff over the last 4 episodes, asking a lot of questions and leaving a lot of tidbits here and there. And we're definitely going to, we'll be answering many things in episode 5, but we won't be answering everything in episode 5. And I think maybe what's interesting, as I completely dodge your question, maybe what's interesting to think about is that for me, the long dark is not just what happens in Wintermute, and it's not just what happens in survival mode. I mean, this is just one small window into a series of events. And I have a timeline for many long dark storylines. Whether we realize all of them or not remains to be seen. Yeah. But that go out many years. So it's more of a grand kind of survival saga.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing in Wintermute is just sort of the first piece of it.
Well, and I love Methuselah. We are witnessing the apocalypse of an apocalypse, and it just sounds too big. And it's sort of, it becomes almost the apocalypse and the North become these two sort of overwhelming forces that are just driving Will forward. Right. It's really quite neat. So, yeah. You've spoken about the survival mode and the story mode. I've been, of course, focusing more on story mode because that's what my students were looking at. But how do you balance your priorities between the development of story versus survival, or when you're designing a new location? Are you thinking of it through how that's going to be progressing the narrative of Wintermute, or are you usually thinking of where people can find their own spaces and find themselves?
Yeah, I mean, the answer depends a little bit on at what point in development we've been. Um, when we launched Long Dark on Kickstarter, it was conceived so back in 2013, before so this is a year before it launched on Steam. I really was thinking about it as quite a modest, tight, narrative focused experience that was probably only going to be a few hours long. It might be interesting to some of your students who are fans to know that the Long Dark actually started out as an iPad game. And the intention for it was to be sort of like a playable survival diary of story of this survival in Northern Canada because, during this apocalyptic event. And we quickly realized that we would be so constrained by that hardware that we quickly shifted to a full PC game, and I'm very happy that we did. But we started it, so as I said, it was really intended to be more of a narrative focused experience. And then when we launched our Kickstarter and we shared some of our early test builds, what we found was that people were really hesitant to play test the game because they really didn't want to spoil the story, which is totally understandable. So, but we also found it very, very helpful to be able to share the game with players and get feedback on mechanics and tuning and whatnot. And that was at the time a very unique experience for us. Most of my team was like myself, coming from large scale AAA development where you would work on a game for 4 or 5 years and then you would launch it and you kind of cross your fingers and hope that it's okay.
Yeah.
So for us, it was very new to have access to a player community that could share feedback and we could kind of tune live and whatnot. And interestingly, like the last 10 years has only been that for us. The last 8 years of development has all been about this community informed approach. So because of Kickstarter, we had this relatively small community of 6,000 or 7,000 backers, some small number of which were happy to jump in and give us feedback. And we thought, well, we need more of this. We need more feedback. So we thought, let's go. At the time, Steam had this thing called Early Access, which was just starting up.
Yeah.
And it was this idea that you could share your game in the sort of work in progress with the community, with the understanding that it was going to develop over time. And we thought, well, that's an interesting opportunity for us to get more feedback from our players, but we also understand they don't really want to know anything about the narrative and spoil it for themselves. So we kind of stripped all of that out and intentionally really removed a lot of the flavor of the world. So we simplified signage, we simplified lots of things. We made them very abstract, almost to try to distract players from them, to think, almost as a way to signpost to say, don't worry, this is going to get replaced later on.
Something will happen, but
yeah,
just don't look at this yet.
That's right. Just ignore it for now, and it'll be clear later. And what we didn't expect is that when we launched this little piece of sandbox content, which back then was only Mystery Lake, that it would resonate so strongly with the audience, and it just really took off for us on Steam. And partly because it was unique, partly because early access was exploding at the time, partly because survival games were really finding their stride at the time. And so for us, it was really a function of timing as well, and luck, as it always is. And it, kind of blew up for us. And so we realized, okay, now we have this big community of people who really love this piece of the game, the sandbox experience.
Yeah.
And so for the next few years, as we continue to expand the systems layer of the game, we continue to expand the world of the game as well to accommodate that. And so a lot of the early regions of the game were informed more by wanting to build out that sandbox than anything really specifically narrative driven, although narrative was always in the back of our minds. And so then when we started releasing our episodes, the episodes were set in the same locations that we had built for survival mode. Even though we did build them with story in mind, they were specifically built for the sandbox. It's only when we got to, honestly, episode 4 is the first episode where we actually built a bespoke region just for the episode, and then did the opposite. We released it in episode 4, and then shortly thereafter we put that region into the survival mode, into the sandbox as well. Episode 5 will be the same. It'll be new regions that are specifically made for the episodes, and then presumably we'll roll them back into the sandbox as well, though that's still an open question.
But Tales from the Far Territory is sort of, it's just survival in that bit,
right.
with some narrative notes, I believe.
Yeah, so Tales from the Far Territory is kind of a new thing for us in the sense that, and those of you who've played the game know that we have this very hard break between survival and story. which is different from how a lot of open world games are, where it's a little bit more like the player can decide, hey, I want to, do this quest right now, and then I want to pick flowers or find flags or whatever the heck the open world stuff is.
Very good way of losing the plot, like in a literal way. Like if you wander off too far, it's really hard to find your narrative point. So yeah.
That's true. That's very
Sometimes
true.
the split is preferable.
Yeah, I mean, we split it for practical reasons, and there's a part of me over the years that always wondered whether that had somehow diminished the effect of the game. But interestingly, over the years, what we've heard from our players is that they prefer it this way, which was unexpected to us. With Tales from the Far Territory, we're playing a little bit with trying to bring some narrative back into the survival mode experience. Nothing as authored as Wintermute, nothing as like very where we really get our hands and direct an experience. And Wintermute is really about the Long Dark as an IP. It's about trying to really give background to the world, create some characters that you hopefully get invested in, set the foundation of a story that we can continue telling in the future. But it has a very specific kind of narrative purpose. With Tales from the Far Territory, it's a little bit more of an opportunity for us to, sprinkle that survival mode experience with these little narrative beats that are still very much player driven. It's really about the pacing that you choose as a player, that whether you want to even explore these stories or not is really up to you. But it also is an opportunity for us to introduce a few little bits and pieces of lore and background that both reward players who literally go off the beaten path to try to find, the answers to these stories, but also the players that are, fans of both survival and Wintermute will pick up some little details here and there through Tales from the Far Territory that will add some context to things that they've experienced in Wintermute. So it's our way of kind of linking them even more strongly than we have in the past. And we are coming to a strange point for us, which is at some point when episode 5 comes out, the story will be done. At least the first part, the Wintermute part of the story will be done. Yeah. And then players will be able to experience it all at once. So new players at that point, or people who've been playing for a long time that will start maybe from scratch, will be able to go through the entire experience of Wintermute, then go into the survival mode and have this insight that they've gained from Tales from the Far Territory and maybe other things that we do as well in the future, and sort of see this holistic, world experience of the Long Dark across all these different modes. So it's been a very long running kind of process of story architecture across all these different things, and trying to make sure that they all kind of fit and are complementary in this truly cross-platform kind of way.
Now, you've been releasing releasing the game and releasing the narrative in these sort of segments. Do you think that it will be a different experience for someone to have that totality, have the complete game there? Or is that hesitation and that delay and that anticipation actually part of the experience for the story?
I think it depends on what kind of a player you are.
Completionist, so yeah.
Well, or maybe not what kind of a player you are, but maybe how. Let me put it this way: we have some players, and fortunately for us, they seem to be a minority. There are some players who are definitely frustrated by the pace of release of the episodes. And, it's a little bit like how, Netflix has taught us all to binge TV. And now we see everybody backtracking from binging because they realize, look, if you have this business model that depends on keeping subscribers, maybe it's a little bit better to hold on to your content and not just sort of shoot it all out the door at the same time.
Yeah.
We have players who, completely understandably, were promised a story mode when we did a Kickstarter that they thought they were going to get more very quickly. In our defense, it was a much more modest game at that point. We feel that we've delivered probably 10 times, 20 times, 50 times more content than we ever planned to deliver in the game. But that doesn't mean it's been quick. Certainly we've taken our time. I can't argue at all that we've been fast in any way whatsoever. And so that can be frustrating for people. They want to be able to play a story. They don't want to start it and know that the ending isn't there yet. So there are people that are kind of waiting for episode 5 to be finished before they jump in. Yeah. And that's completely understandable. The frustration is completely understandable. It's not what we want for them, but it's, it is what it is. Likewise, I think there's a large percentage of our player base who, you play the survival mode kind of in between the episodes, to fill their time, and they find it very compelling. So it's not a problem for them to kind of wait.
Yeah.
And the years in between episode 1 and episode 5 have been part of their journey of the Long Dark. And so for them, it's just another piece of the experience. It's not that story mode has primacy over survival. It's just, oh, now there's another drop of narrative content that tells us another piece of story. And that's just part of their kind of the life cycle for them of what the game is.
But they can weave that into their understanding of the space.
Absolutely. And so I think if you're a player who wants to be able to sit down and play a game from A to Z and be finished with it, of course, it's very frustrating to think, oh my gosh, how many years am I gonna wait for this thing? But on the other hand, we have people who've been playing the game for 8 years.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's not a small accomplishment either, to keep players engaged for that long. And I think that's where you have these people who've played for hundreds or thousands of hours, for whom the Long Dark has been a bit of become kind of a hobby in a way, and has been part of their lives. We have, something that makes me feel very old is like when I read feedback from players who are like, I was 10 when I started playing your game, and now I just got my driver's license. It's like, oh God,
oh, thanks.
Wow,
that's great. Yeah.
But to also have been part of people's lives for 8 or 9 years and have played, have occupied some place in their time, in their pastime, in their hobbies, in their love of playing games, in their love of fiction. I mean, that's a place of privilege for us, right, to have that. So I wish we could go more quickly. We work very carefully. We balance a lot of different things with not a huge team. We're very careful about how we treat our team. We don't crunch. We're very mindful of that. And so that also, I think is important.
Huge.
And there's always someone out there that wishes that they had the thing yesterday. There's always someone out there who's going to yell at you about it. At the end of the day, I think the thing that matters is when we ship episode 5, do people feel like it was worth the wait? And that's really what we're focused on.
Yeah. So I mean, it's the end of the world. Let's maybe not rush it. Let's take our time here and enjoy that experience. Couple of sort of last questions before we open it up. You've spoken about sort of the narrative appeal and sort of that draw that keeps players engaged. Now, one of the other things that, of course, keeps player engagement is the mechanics and that sort of investment in the inputs and the feedback that we get. What was the hardest sort of mechanical structuring, or what was the hardest game mechanic for you to implement? Where was your greatest challenge there?
Right. So I think there's two questions here. One is the mechanic of greatest challenge, and the other is what is the mechanic that you've had to remove and I think they're somewhat related to each other. So there's a mechanic. We have cabin fever in the game, which I'm sure some of you have encountered, and it's not that the mechanic itself has been hard to implement. It's just their realization of a sort of psychological state for the player is really tricky to pull off in a first-person game.
Yeah.
And it can be frustrating because you're imposing a psychological state on a survivor character that the player themselves doesn't feel. And so it feels like an unfair or arbitrary restriction that's being put on them in a way that is different somehow than saying that the character is starving when you're clearly not starving, or the character is exhausted when you're clearly not exhausted. But there's something about that imposition of a mental state that is sometimes hard for players who have decided, or maybe it's not even a conscious decision. It's they've sort of inhabited that survivor character themselves. It's very immersive. They feel like they're in the middle of that blizzard. So for them to have this mood sort of state imposed on them kind of breaks that illusion a little bit. It's like the game is telling them now, oh, you can't stay indoors because you have cabin fever. And it's just very hard, in a third person game where you see your character on the screen, players already have one step removal from it and they're more willing to accept things like that. But when you feel really that you inhabit that character, it's really hard to to accept that. So that's a mechanic that we've tuned a lot over the years. Lots of people have asked us to take it out. We've left it in, but we also created it as an option within our custom mode. So for people who are really hateful of it, they can get rid of it.
You can just turn that off. It's fine.
You can turn it off. I still think it's very compelling in a way because it feels realistic to the scenario. It's a thing that is a real problem for people who are on their own for a long time in these extreme survival type situations. It's something that I think in the future I'd like to come back to when we have a better way to approach it. And I think there's a dimension of survival there that's, as you know, if you read anything about survival literature, it's like 90% about mental state, the success of getting through a difficult problem. And trying to simulate that within an interactive experience is a huge challenge, but I think if someone can pull it off, it could be very compelling. So it's definitely something that I keep thinking about. In terms of a mechanic that we implemented and had to pull out, in our original release of Wintermute, the first 2 episodes, 1 and 2, we had this like trust mechanic in there so that you could develop, trust with so Grey Mother, let's say in episode 1, or Jeremiah in episode 2, there was literally like a map almost with each character that would show kind of a level of trust and what you would unlock as you gain more trust with that character. And with our dialogue system, even we have these sort of floating topics. And the intention with that system was to try to reflect the character's mental state somewhat, not the players, but the NPC's mental state with by how these words were being represented. So this idea that if there's a little tiny topic tucked behind my head here, this is something that I don't want to talk about. Right?
Sort of back of mind.
That's right. It's back of mind where it's like I'm trying to hide it from you. Whereas over here, the thing that's really big in your face is like, this is what I want to talk about. And I really wanted to try to like simulate again that the combination of like, as you gained more trust with this character, or they had more trust in you, that the things that they were less likely to want to share with you were kind of going to come a little bit more to the forefront. And we implemented a version of that, and it didn't really resonate with players the way that we were expecting or hoping, and I think we just didn't quite get it right, and it was just one of those things that I could tell was going to take a lot of effort to try to really deliver. And it also impacted a little bit that stuff that I was talking about with the characterization of Grey Mother, for example, and this character who maybe wasn't super likable, but you had this whole list of things that you had to do for them, and you had to gain this relationship with them, even though you didn't really want to do that. It just felt a little bit too much. And so we pulled it out. Again, like with Cabin Fever, I'm still super intrigued by the idea of it. I would like to go back and really figure out how to do that properly. Maybe not in this game, maybe it's something in the future. But I really feel strongly that is an interesting avenue for exploration and narrative and interactive experiences. And so, maybe you'll see it again someday from something that we make.
And I'm really interested in the idea that the dialogue options being more projecting of the NPC state, because actually when we were talking about it in class, a number of students were highlighting how it was really interesting that Will's first question was always right up front, and maybe something that would be in back of mind for the NPC, which is less interesting to Will because the first question up is always Astrid. That his driver was that kind of. So it's interesting that you were thinking of it in from the opposite perspective, but it still created that same sense of what is going to be that first topic of conversation versus what is the sort of broader world. So,
well, and you touch on another important part, which is when you give players a choice in dialogue, you risk breaking the illusion of the character that they're playing, because if you're lost in the Canadian wilderness and your ex-wife, who you still feel strongly about, is missing, and that's your number one priority is trying to find her, you're not going to, the first person you meet, you're not going to get into some big discussion with them about some completely ancillary topic, right? So really, if we didn't have Astrid be such a prominent sort of concern in Mackenzie's dialogue, you also as a player wouldn't feel that sense of urgency to find her. And the sense of urgency to find her, that's always a really difficult thing to deliver in a game, because we want you to feel a sense of emotional investment in people who you don't know. You don't know you don't have any feeling about Astrid. Who's Astrid? Astrid's a character that exists on a screen. You saw her for 2 minutes in a cinematic. Like, why should you go, traipse across the Canadian wilderness and risk your life for this?
Well, because she's voiced by Jennifer Hale, and therefore we're all invested.
Yes, I mean, there's always that, of course. Jennifer Hale, I mean, who wouldn't, run all over Canada for her? But I'm just saying, like, it's that shorthand that you get away with it in a film or in a novel or something like that because you expect it as part of the medium. With games, it's very hard because you're often trying to use that as a shorthand, a narrative shorthand, and you don't have the time to literally develop a relationship with an AI character necessarily always to have that sense of investment. And so we use that shorthand of relationships to do it. But yes, it's a good observation that, Mackenzie is asking a lot about Astrid all the time. And, that's also a challenge writing 4 or 5 episodes where every time Mackenzie meets someone, he tries to ask in a different way, have you seen Astrid? And it's but yeah, so those are some things that have come and gone, and some are mechanics and some are more about tone, and it's just part of what's great about game development, especially when you do it in this way, is that you can, and I'm very grateful to have that we have a community that's supportive of it. I think we might be the first game that I know of that ever has gone back and redone the first 2 parts of their story and fundamentally changed it. Like, I mean, I rewrote the entire episodes, we recorded all the dialogue. Like, we really, even though maybe the plot beats are relatively similar, like the core story, did change. And you can still play that old version. If you go to our time capsule on Steam, you can find that initial 1.0 version of Wintermute. And if you're curious, you can play through that stuff that I talked about, and then you can compare it afterwards if you want to the second version and see how it changed.
Well, we're hitting 10:20, which means we can open up the floor. We've only had one question come up in the messages, and I think, Roan, it was addressed on the idea of playtesting and community. Though if I'm incorrect, do feel free to jump in. Does anyone have any questions? Anything that they would like to ask about Long Dark and Hinterland and all of that fun stuff? This will also be the flag for any of the students who have a 10:30 class. You might need to be logging off and heading off, but hopefully most of you are able to stay with us.
They're all sleeping.
I mean, it's earlier for you. We're hitting 20 after 10 here. We should all be nice and awake. While people are contemplating, I guess I'll ask my own little curiosity. Is Wintermute a reference to Neuromancer? Is this a hat tip to a fellow Canadian? No. Okay. Where does it come from?
It's not a hat tip to William Gibson, although I'm a big fan. You'll have to wait and see.
Okay.
Wintermute will be explained in episode 5.
Okay. That's extra alluring then. I will admit I'm midway through episode 2. The bear is freaking me out. I have this.
I apologize for the bear.
Oh, you have cued that we're going to have to face the bear. The bear has chased me a couple of times. I am not keen on that bear. And one of my students who has played through all of episode 2 has warned me, you do actually face the bear. So I will muster the bravery to deal with that later. Alicia, I'm seeing a hand up there if you want to unmute.
I was wondering, like how much of the story was like informed by your own personal experience? I mean, not that I expect you to have been in a plane crash and had to like search for someone and try to survive. But just like, what made you want to do a survival story in winter in a apocalyptic Canada specifically, and like what of that very strange world do you relate to?
Yeah, I mean, probably I could do a whole talk just on that, but I've always been really interested in all apocalyptic literature, film, games. It's just for whatever reason, the end of the world is super interesting to me, not in a nihilistic way, but more in the sense of there's something really alluring to me about like that sense of abandonment and moving through an environment that's where the people are mostly gone. And I think that we all are in our own way typically intrigued by, like the premise of The Walking Dead, for example. Like, it's the end of the world, it's zombies. It's like, what does it really mean? And the end of the world part and the zombies part is kind of like just a backdrop at some point. And ultimately, it's really more about how the people react. And I think that sense of pushing people into an extreme scenario kind of brings out elements of their character that wouldn't come out in day-to-day life. So I think that's interesting. I think I've talked a bit about the reasons for the Canadian aspects of the Long Dark. And so I think you could say that my intention with the Long Dark, and hopefully we've succeeded, is to add to the kind of pantheon of post-apocalyptic, art, and whether it's film, TV, literature, or games, and represent kind of our point of view or a different point of view on what that could look like from a Canadian perspective. I've not been in a plane crash in the wilderness, but I have spent a fair amount of time in the wilderness, including a lot of time in northern British Columbia and Alberta in the far, far wilderness, where probably nobody but First Nations people had ever been. And certainly it really left an impact on me. I was fortunate as a kid to travel across Canada a lot. So I've seen most of our country, which I know is not a common experience necessarily. And so I have a great love of the landscape and just really wanted to try to find a way to show a piece of it, in the game. So does that answer your question, Alicia?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. I saw a comment from Catherine here in the chat as well. She mentioned Margaret Atwood, which I really appreciate too, is a chance to talk about her. And Northrop Frye has that whole concept of garrison mentality, which I don't know if you've talked about in your class, but
No.
That's also a big piece of, I think, what we're trying to talk about in the Long Dark is that sense of Canadian identity that emerges from that realization that, you're this tiny little light in the darkness of this vast nature around you. And I think that's definitely very thematic to the Long Dark.
Yeah, we did touch on sort of the opposite side of that, which of course is the rise of the Wendigo. So isolation leading to madness and consumption, rather than that isolation as being that sole light. Have a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. We'll start with Xander. Xander, do you want to ask directly, or do you want me to speak for you? I will take Xander staying on mute, meaning that I will jump on in here. He's asked, you talk about Astrid as otherwise being an AI character we don't see much of in the first episode. Was the decision to play as Astrid later in Wintermute influenced by trying to get the player more emotionally invested? So was that something that changed as you were developing it, or was that always going to be part of your game plan initially?
Very, very early in the development of the Long Dark story, the original intention, going back to the sort of the Kickstarter and pre-Kickstarter even, was to tell the story from Mackenzie's point of view. Mm-hmm. And that was really more about scope. That was really more about what we thought we could accomplish with the resources that we thought we would have. It was only, because of the success of the game on Steam and that we realized we could do a lot more, that at that point, I really felt like I didn't want to make a game that was about another bearded white guy, looking for a woman somewhere, rescuing the princess kind of thing, which has never been the intention of the Long Dark. But
it doesn't feel that way. There's no damsel.
It doesn't feel that way. Right. She's not a damsel at all, but it would have been harder to say that if you still only got to play Mackenzie and everything would have been from his point of view. And it's been really important to me, and I don't think we've succeeded with it necessarily so far. And my hope is that by the end of episode 5, people will feel like the story is a bit more balanced between them. But the idea is really that it is the story. It's both their stories. It's Mackenzie's story. We start with him. He gets the first 2 episodes for sure. That was more of a mistake on our part because of how we sort of scoped out the game and realized at one point, episode 1 and 2 originally I had thought of as one episode, and we realized, oh my gosh, it's just too big. We can't do this all in one. Yeah. But the idea was to try to swap between them. And so we did 1 and 2 with Mackenzie. You see some of the aftermath of the events of episode 1 in Milton, and the story that you hear of Astrid in Milton from Grey Mother's point of view. You see the aftermath of it in episode 3 and experience more as Astrid and get a little tidbit of her experience as a doctor before, et cetera, et cetera. Then 4 is back to Mackenzie in the aftermath of episode 2, and then 5 will have both of them, awesome. and wrapping up the story of both of their stories. So It's, it is partly about empathy for Astrid as being able to inhabit her as a player. It's partly also wanting to, and I think, female gamers are a lot more comfortable playing a character of opposite gender than male players tend to be, because
it comes with practice.
It comes with practice, of course. You've grown up in an industry where you almost never had a character that like represented you necessarily. And so for me, it was very, very important to be able to represent more than just one point of view, in a way that's also challenging today. It's something that we have to be super mindful of as well. Sometimes it feels like you have to be very sensitive to how you represent other people in fiction now, as I'm sure you know, with good reason, right? And so, but yeah, ultimately it's a story about Mackenzie and Astrid. It's not just Mackenzie's story, and hopefully people feel as invested in Astrid as they do in Mackenzie.
All right, I think we've got about 30 seconds. If we can get a very quick response from Espen, we have a question about game mechanics. How do you choose what gets scaled up or scaled down for game difficulty?
Pretty much everything is designed so the Long Dark is actually a deceptively complex game under the hood, and so everything, all the systems have been designed and layered, and they interact with each other in quite sophisticated ways. And so when we build them with many different sort of tuning hooks, and like imagine knobs and levers and things so that you can change many different aspects of them, and
elements.
That's right. And so then we introduce this concept of experience modes, and we intentionally don't talk about them as difficulty or challenge based. It's really more about what you prefer. Do you prefer to have more of a survival experience, or do you prefer to have more of a narrative or exploration experience? And then we can kind of tune different aspects of challenge, or not even challenge, but resource cost or time, or whatever different variables, to make certain aspects of the game sort of elevated over others. So like exploration is really more of a focus on this side, survival is more of a focus on this side. You want to be right in the middle. And then with the sort of the custom settings option, you can really decide, not with a huge amount of granularity, but like we try to offer a lot of different choice there in terms of what you can sort of turn on and off, or how plentiful resources are, how plentiful wildlife is, et cetera, predators versus prey, all that kind of stuff. So it's really more about trying to expose many choices for the player, because we understand that every player is different and people are looking for different things.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, and last comment that we have is one of my students would really like to see Wolverines to make it extra Canadian, which I will agree. And we've also got a call for Canadian geese. Geese are terrifying. I think that's a bridge too far. Let's stick with the
yeah,
let's
think bears are scary. Wait till you see the Canadian geese in the game. Oh,
they're terrifying. Anyway, I think on that slightly silly note, we will say thank you so very much for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure to have you speaking with my class, and all of those who were able to join us as well. Thank you everyone for attending and joining us, and have a wonderful Wednesday. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. All right, talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.